Somewhere in your family tree, thousands of generations back, everyone had the same skin. Then humans walked out of Africa and spread across the planet. And something strange happened. Skin color changed again and again in different places, for different reasons. And for most of history, nobody understood why. So they made things up. Curses, hierarchies, entire legal systems, built on a misunderstanding of biology. This is the buried history of the world's most misused piece of skin. Here's the real answer, the one it took modern genetics to prove. Skin color comes down to melanin, a pigment produced by cells called melanocytes. Every human being has roughly the same number of these cells. What differs is how much melanin they produce, and that comes down to one thing above all: ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Near the equator, UV radiation is intense. Too much of it destroys folate, a nutrient essential for healthy pregnancies, and it damages skin cells directly. So populations that lived near the equator for tens of thousands of years evolved higher melanin production. More melanin means more protection. Further from the equator, sunlight is weaker, and the problem flips. Bodies need UV exposure to produce vitamin D. Too much melanin blocks that process, so populations in low sunlight regions evolved lighter skin to let in enough UV to stay healthy. That's it. That's the entire mechanism. A pigment balancing two competing survival needs: folate protection against vitamin D production, tuned by geography over tens of thousands of years. No hierarchy, no curse, just sunlight and chemistry. But humans didn't have microscopes or genetics for most of their history. So for millennia, they built other explanations. Long before anyone understood UV radiation, people needed a story to explain why the traders, soldiers, and travelers they encountered looked different from themselves. Ancient Greek writers proposed that skin color was shaped directly by climate, the sun literally burning certain populations dark over generations. It wasn't a moral judgment yet, mostly a geographic one. Ancient Egyptian art shows a clear awareness of different skin tones among neighboring peoples, painted with distinct color conventions for Egyptians, Nubians, Levantines, and Libyans, simply as a way of marking identity and origin. Mesopotamian and other Near Eastern cultures had their own ideological myths, folk stories explaining why some people were born with dark skin, some light, usually tied to ancestry or divine will rather than science. These early explanations were often neutral, or at least not built around ranking one group above another. That changed once skin color got tangled up with religion and power. The turning point came from a single, badly misread Bible passage. In the book of Genesis, Noah curses his grandson Canaan to servitude after a family dispute. Nowhere in the original text is skin color mentioned. But starting in the medieval period, and accelerating sharply in the 1400s, writers began reinterpreting this story as a curse specifically on black Africans, inventing a link between dark skin and a divine sentence of slavery. A Portuguese chronicler writing in 1453 was among the first to explicitly connect enslaved Africans to this so-called curse of Ham. Over the following centuries, as the transatlantic slave trade expanded into a massive economic system, this reinterpretation became a convenient religious justification, taught from pulpits across Europe and later the American South, giving slaveholders a way to claim their system was divinely sanctioned, rather than simply profitable. Abolitionists eventually picked the argument apart. The curse in Genesis was placed on Canaan, not Ham. It said nothing about race. But by then, the myth had done its damage. It had provided centuries of cover for something economics had already decided. By the 1700s and 1800s, a new kind of justification emerged, dressed up in the language of science instead of scripture. European naturalists began sorting humanity into rigid racial categories, ranking them by skin color, skull shape, and invented notions of intelligence. Physicians and anatomists measured skulls, compared facial angles, and published elaborate charts claiming to prove that lighter-skinned populations were biologically superior. None of it held up. The methods were cherry-picked, the conclusions decided in advance, the data bent to fit a hierarchy that colonial and slaveholding economies desperately needed to justify. This wasn't fringe pseudoscience kept in the shadows. It was published in respected journals, taught in universities, and cited directly by lawmakers. Race science gave 19th century power structures exactly what they wanted, a scientific-sounding excuse for a system built on exploitation. As European empires expanded, skin color became an administrative tool. Colonial governments in places like India, the Caribbean, and Latin America built entire caste-like systems ranking people by exact shade, granting different legal rights, jobs, and social status depending on how light or dark someone appeared. In Spanish colonial territories, a system called casta painting literally cataloged dozens of racial mixing categories, each with its own name and social rank. This didn't just create prejudice between colonizers and colonized, it planted colorism inside communities themselves, a preference for lighter skin that colonized populations were pressured, sometimes violently, to internalize. That internalized hierarchy didn't disappear when empires fell. It became embedded in beauty standards, marriage practices, and job markets that persisted long after colonial rule ended. Nowhere did the obsession with categorizing skin color get stranger than in the legal systems built to enforce racial hierarchy. In the United States, so-called one-drop rules declared that any trace of African ancestry, regardless of actual appearance, legally classified a person as black, stripping them of rights under segregation-era law. Some states tried to define race using fractions, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, essentially doing arithmetic on ancestry to decide who could marry whom, vote, or attend which school. The results were absurd. Siblings were sometimes legally classified as different races. People who appeared entirely white were denied rights because a great-grandparent's ancestry showed up in a courthouse record. Passing, living as a different race than one's legal classification, became both a survival strategy and, in many places, a criminal offense. These weren't fringe rules. They shaped marriage law, inheritance, and citizenship for generations. Colorism didn't stay confined to former colonies. It shows up today in cultures worldwide, often with no direct European colonial history at all. In parts of East and South Asia, skin lightening products form a massive industry, driven by beauty standards that predate European contact, but were often reinforced by it. In West Africa, skin bleaching creams, some containing dangerous levels of mercury or steroids, remain widely used despite serious health risks and government bans in several countries. Meanwhile, in parts of the world with historically lighter-skinned populations, deliberate tanning became fashionable, an inversion where darker skin, achieved voluntarily, signaled leisure and wealth rather than the opposite. The specifics vary by culture, but the underlying pattern repeats: skin color, an evolutionary adaptation to sunlight, keeps getting recruited as a marker of status, wherever humans happen to be. Genetic research has quietly demolished nearly everything race science claimed to prove. There is more genetic variation within any single so-called racial group than there is between groups. Skin color itself is controlled by a relatively small number of genes, and those genes can shift over surprisingly few generations when populations migrate to new climates. Some of the most genetically diverse people on Earth live within a few hundred miles of each other in sub-Saharan Africa, a region race science lumped into a single monolithic category. The genes for light skin in Europeans and light skin in East Asians aren't even the same genes, meaning light skin evolved independently, more than once, in different populations, through different mutations. Skin color turns out to be one of the most genetically shallow traits in human biology, a thin adaptive layer sitting on top of a species that is, underneath, remarkably uniform. The science has been settled for decades, and yet the hierarchies built on top of the old myths haven't fully gone away. Colorism still shapes hiring decisions, media representation, and beauty industries worth billions of dollars globally. Legal echoes of racial classification systems still surface in immigration law, census categories, and court cases. The biology was never the problem. Melanin is just a molecule doing its job, protecting cells, regulating vitamin D, responding to sunlight exactly as it evolved to. The problem was always what humans decided to build on top of it. Somewhere in your family tree, thousands of generations back, everyone had the same skin. The differences that came after were never a hierarchy. They were sunlight, written into skin, one climate at a time.